In this video we're going to talk about the research process. Now this is just one video in several on this topic and related topics. So it's important that you look at the other videos as well in this series of classes. But for the moment let's start by looking at the various steps in the business research process. And the first one is to identify a problem that needs understanding and solution. It's the most basic step. It's the one where it all starts. Identify a problem that needs understanding and solution. Research must start from that point. Defining the problem in a way that will make it easy to understand and will enable the researcher to focus on its solution. So it's important to define the problem, to first of all identify it and then define it and set it out clearly so that the researchers can focus on trying to get a solution to the problem. Next, plan an appropriate research design and select the research method to be used. So having identified the problem and having set out the problem in a way that is amenable to research, now work out what is the best research strategy. What's the best design? Is it interview, questionnaire, looking at secondary data? Is it using particular statistical tools? Try to work out what's the most appropriate way forward to get an insight into the problem and trying to get a solution. If sampling is to be used, ensure that the sample is free from bias and also sufficiently large to give confidence to the results. Free from bias may not be possible, and if that's the case, then list the limitations of the selected approach in the project. So looking for an appropriate research design may lead the researcher down the sampling route. And generally speaking, that is what happens. It's the cheapest way to go. But sampling to try and find the characteristics of a population from a sample is complicated. It's complicated and it's sometimes not very reliable. It depends on the sources of data available and how the sample is drawn. Is it random or is it non-random? So working out the average of a sample may indicate the average of the population, but it may be plus or minus a large percentage. So we may say that the average of the population is a certain amount lying between certain limits. So there are issues, and there are issues about the selection of the sample itself. Bias is one of the big problems. If the data is just collected by the researcher, it may reflect individual preferences and biases. The individual researcher may take a clipboard and stand on the street, but only stop the people that he or she likes, or he or she believes will stop and give them answers. So it's biased. And also, how big should the sample be? Should it be half the population, quarter of the population? How big should it be? And that's a second problem. It's also important to work out the data collection and evaluation techniques. The data collection, as I said, could be sampling, or it could be secondary data, or it could be a variety of sources. It could be interviews. So work out the data collection method, and then how will the responses be evaluated? How will the answers that were given in, let's say, a questionnaire, how will the answers be worked out? How will they be treated? How will they be interpreted? It's important that they are interpreted honestly and as frankly as possible. They should not be misinterpreted. Otherwise the whole exercise is a waste of time and possibly dangerous. It could lead to erroneous results and action based on bad results. The findings should clarify the original proposal. That's the whole idea. The findings should shed light on the original problem and should start to suggest a solution to the original problem. That's why the exercise was undertaken in the first place. The final report presentation should be professional and meet the needs of the client, the supervisor or the institution or whoever the client was or is. But the final report should be professional. It should be clearly presented. It should be logical, and also it should represent a very professional approach to data presentation, and it'll give credibility to the overall exercise. It was done with care and attention. Now, the business problems and questions. First of all, as I said, identify the problem and then initiate the research into the problem. And these are the two starting points. Clearly, a problem must be observed and must be encountered, and secondly, the research should be initiated, it should be designed and delivered with the purpose of solving the problem or identifying the problem solutions, identifying possible solutions to the problem. Now, the business question categories. Well, the type of question that needs solution may be mathematical. For example, what level of production does the business require? And it may be logistical. How should the product be delivered? And what routes should the lorries or the transport take? What levels of stock control should the business hold? These are mathematical type questions. The final solution may be a number. The company should produce 100 of these items, or the company should hold £100,000 worth of stock. So normally it's quantitative, and that would be a mathematical type solution. It could be attitudinal, that the research is aimed at finding attitudes. For example, attitudes of customers towards the product, or the attitude of workers towards working in the company. Looking at the hygiene issues at work, for example, looking at the conditions of work, looking at how the offices are structured and if it's nice or not nice, and so it's looking at attitudinal issues. 3 is market research, assessing customer attitude and experiences. Now, I've already hinted at those when I talked about attitudinal research, but it may be that it's a complete focus on the customer, looking at attitudes of the customer, but also looking at the distribution of customers, looking at past buying behavior of customers. So there are different types of business question relating to the customers for the product. It may also be business research trying to determine what are the industry norms and best practices. What are other companies in the industry doing? What are similar companies doing in terms of production techniques, in terms of stock holding, in terms of training for the workers? What are the industry norms? What are the best practices? And a business may wish to determine this about other companies in the industry. There are 2 other types of business category. The solution identified from the research should be supported by evidence and logical argument. Now, business categories are not often they don't often come in very clear questions. Sometimes the questions may be a little confusing, so it's important to have a category where the solutions are identified from the research and supported by evidence and logical argument set out clearly. So it's a category of question which is amenable to logical solution, logical argument, logical points, and there is clear evidence as to the nature of the solution. In business, the solutions should be practical and feasible. That's very important, and it's enabling research into business question categories which are feasible. There may be business question categories which are not feasible, but there's little point in recommending a solution that is outside the available budget or has not yet been invented. What's the point of investigating something which cannot be afforded? So question categories have to be feasible. They have to be capable of being completed. And they're only the ones which are logical and which make sense in a structured sense should be undertaken. So these are two further types of business question categories. Now the whole process of addressing the business question should be methodically structured. Ensure that the research question is clear. That's very important. Absolute clarity in the research question. Examine past research and current thinking on the problem. Try to find out what was done in the past in the same area. How was past research structured and what were the outcomes of that research? And try to figure out the differences between the past research and the current research problem. Try to separate out any components of the research question and deal with them separately. It may be possible to look at the research question in parts. It may be a research area rather than a single question, in which case there may be several sub-questions. We'll try to identify those and try to deal with each one separately, if possible. Carefully match evidence with the questions and then perform the analysis. It's important to look at the evidence, look at what has been found, and match that with the questions and then perform analysis. To what extent does the evidence contradict what would be expected? To what extent does the evidence support what was expected? Give reasons why. When the business problem is identified, investigative questions should be developed. These should point the way forward by clarifying the question. These are usually what, who, where, when, and why. What is the problem? Who's involved in this? Where is the problem? Where is it manifest? When did this happen? And why? Why are we looking at it? And why is there a problem? So those are the perennial questions that are asked when we have a problem. What, who, where, when, and why. The questions should always be posed in a straightforward manner. Try to make the questions as simple and as straightforward as possible. That will facilitate the research. The questions must relate to the literature, past research in the area, and form the basis for the current research. So, generally speaking, there has always been some research done in the area. Maybe it's the time we live, but a lot of research work has been conducted in the past in many areas, and it's important for researchers to be aware of what was done in the past and to have access to that literature and be able to produce a literature review based on past research and past experiences. There should also be measurement questions. These attempt to quantify responses and other data. So, wherever possible, try to measure the responses. Try to get some quantitative insight into the issue. A quantitative approach is seen as probably the strongest approach possible. So it's important to try to quantify results wherever possible. Now, the review of related materials, well, there should be a wide exploration of this area. A wide exploration of the area will mean that there are many viewpoints that are being picked up. Some of them opposing each other, some of them indicating good practice or best practice, some of them indicating issues that just simply need to be borne in mind and perhaps addressed. Ideally, it should range from the seminal to the most recent ideas in the area. Seminal is the first one. So a seminal paper is the first paper on a particular topic, the first one that's been published. We call it a seminal paper. And it's important for researchers to know what the seminal paper is in the area. When did it start? Who wrote it? What was the issue? And what was the outcome? And then trace through all the other papers that link back to that seminal paper, to the first paper. So the researcher must be aware of the seminal paper and all of the recent papers. The materials may be published in trade journals, academic papers, the press, expert opinion, or in conferences. So there's a wide variety of sources of information, and it's important that the researcher is aware of these and tries to keep up to date with what is happening in the area. Papers on best practice are particularly useful, particularly in the business area, because businesses are interested in best practice. It's best practice that helps the business most effectively. So, research in fundamental areas are not that important in business. Research in fundamental areas, interesting and maybe useful in providing a framework, but it's really applied research that interests business. How were problems solved in practice? Now, data capture. Well, if possible, the best approach is the simplest one. There are many views in science about what is the best approach to experimentation, or the best approach to collecting data. And it's widely believed that the simplest approach is the best. Try to keep it simple so that it's easy to understand and it's easy to see the relationships. In designing the study to meet the requirements of a research proposal, an efficient study focuses on the selected question only. Now, this is important. It's important to just focus on the question that is posed right at the start. What is the issue? What is the question? Just look at that one question. Don't get sidetracked. Don't drift off into looking at other areas, even though they may look appealing and interesting. They're not the core of the study. The core of the study is addressing the question that was identified at the start. Ensure that the resources and skills are in place to analyze the data. Before the activity takes place, it's important to have a research budget, to know how much it's going to cost, estimated as precisely as possible, and then stick within the budgeted guidelines. Now, The budget should also mention the skills that are required, the type of people that are required. It may require IT people. It may require statisticians or accountants, or it may require psychologists, expert opinions. Whatever is required should be set out, and the resources should be in place to ensure that the data can be analysed. Avoid bias in the data capture exercise. I mentioned this earlier. There are all sources of bias. If it's a questionnaire, the researcher may just stop people who he or she thinks will help. That's biased. It's important to be as objective as possible, to try to avoid any bias. Bias leads to erroneous conclusions, and if decisions are based on wrong conclusions, they can be disastrous. They can be very hurtful to the business. List all known limitations of the study. Look at past studies and find out what were the issues that were identified in past studies. What were the limitations? What were the problems that were encountered? Look at those problems and try to learn from them, and be aware that these problems may arise again. Now, as I said, there should be a resource allocation budget. So attempt to measure the time and resources required for each part of the study. Try to draw up a budget. Try to say, well, the questionnaire design will take X days. It'll need to be piloted. It'll be so many more days. It'll require the following people. They will cost so much. Once it's approved, it needs to be administered. That will be so many days. The researchers will have to be paid. They'll have to be analysed. The people doing the analysis will have to be paid. They will require specialist resources that have to be bought, and so on and so on and so on. So it's important to have a budget that lists these. And try to make realistic estimates. Don't imagine the estimates. Try to be as honest and as open and as accurate as is possible in deriving the estimates. And try to get others to check the estimates, to see that they're broadly correct, that the other people who have an expertise in the area would say that the estimated budget is broadly correct. The research is feasible. It's possible with that budget. In fact, it may involve a table, for example, something like that. It may have the different stages or activities in the research listed. I've just got 7 here. Problem identification, project planning stage, and then the resources. What's required? Time and staff, time, research material, travel, computing resources, presentation skills. And look at the cost of each one. Then I've got it in percentages here, so the cost would be, let's say, of problem identification might be 7% of the final budget. So if the management allocate a certain budget, 7% of it will be to identify the problem, precisely identify the problem. 8% of it will be the project planning stage, and 10% will be reviewing the literature and reviewing the resources. So it's a resource allocation budget. The evaluation methods, well, there could be ex post facto approach. This attempts to solve the problem after it has arisen. So there's a problem, and the problem has arisen within the business, so everyone's aware of the problem, and then it's researched. Well, the problem's already occurred, but it's important to research it so as to learn from the experience, learn from the bad experience if it's a problem, so as to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Try to work it out in a way that it doesn't happen a second time. They have researched it, they understand the issue, they understand the problem, and they can take measures to prevent it happening again. An evaluation method may involve a team or individual appraisal of the recommended results. If a team appraises the recommendation, a consensus or majority view should be agreed in advance. So, having looked at a problem, having evaluated a problem, and having identified some solution, a team may look at this, and the team, presumably of experts, will want to make comments, and ideally the team should agree that this is the solution, that's what the research suggested, and they agree. So it should be a consensus or a majority view that agree that this is the appropriate solution. Set out the decision criteria for the exercise. This may be based on costs and skills required, but set out the decision criteria for the exercise. How will the decision be judged? When the research is being conducted, at what point will the researcher say that this is the solution? This is the solution, or should they continue to research? How will they judge when the solution has been found? Sometimes it's not very clear. So sometimes they will go as far as they can, or as far as they can see, or as far as the budget will permit, and then make recommendations at that stage. So it may be based on costs, or it may be based on skills. Now the contents of a research proposal, well, it's a statement of the research question that has to be in. There must be some idea about what's being researched, so the question must be identified right at the start. There should be a description of the research methodology. How is it going to be conducted? Survey, interviews, secondary material, statistical analysis. How is it going to be researched? If there's data required, how will the data be collected? And how will it be prepared? Will the data be collected and entered into a computer? Will the data be refined? Perhaps it will be worked out as index numbers, or will it be worked out in some way where some decision will be made about outliers, extreme values will be cut off? How will the data be prepared? Then there is the data analysis and interpretation. Having got the data, it should be analysed. This could be done by a statistical package, perhaps on a computer, a statistical program, such as the statistical package for the social sciences, SPSS. Or it could be done in a variety of ways. It may involve statisticians and experts. Management accountants may be involved. Many different skills may be brought to bear in the analysis and interpretation of the results. And then finally, it should be reported. It should be reported, a report compiled, a written report perhaps. There could be a business presentation of the findings. Now let's look at these in a little bit more detail, I should say. Data collection. Well, this is characterized by abstractness. What sort of data is collected? Is it facts and figures related to, let's say, production in the business, the number of items produced over the last year, or is it related to the feelings of management regarding the current practice, current practices within a certain department? Is it the feelings? Is it what they think is happening? Is it what they would like to see and they wanted investigated? Is it abstract? Or is it something which can be counted and which has happened? it's possible to measure the output and say last month the company produced 50, the previous month it produced 40, and so on. Now that's concrete, that's an actual figure. Or is it something vague, like the manager's expectations or the manager's views or aspirations, or what is it that's in the manager's head? That's abstract, but it may need to be researched. Can the research be verified? Is it possible to verify what has been researched? If it's dealing with numbers, let's say production again, well, the records of the business can verify the data. They can just go back and look at the production levels over the last year, and they may verify the data. But if it's looking at people's opinions and looking at ideas in people's heads and trying to get them to articulate what they think, talking to managers and trying to get the managers to articulate what they see as good practice and why they see it as good practice, is that verifiable? Can it be verified? It's difficult. It's elusive. The data may be elusive. It may be easily found through the records of the business, or it might be elusive. It might have to be searched out. So if it's dealing with a manager's aspirations and their opinions about certain aspects of the work, it may mean trying to work with the manager, observe the manager, talk to the manager, talk to workers who are associated with the manager, try to get a wide variety of perspectives to try and make it less elusive, less vague. It may be that it's necessary to become close to the phenomenon. So it might be that the researcher has to become a participant observation, engage in a participant observation technique. The researcher may need to work with that manager on a day-to-day basis and start to relate to what the manager sees as issues and think about the issues as portrayed by the manager. So the researcher is involved, is working with the manager and can see the issues firsthand. That may be required. There's also, of course, data which is secondary data, which is published. That's easy to find, perhaps. It may be in the local libraries, it may be online. If it's specialized data, it may have to be paid for, it may have to be bought, but at least all the work has been done. But secondary data is not that useful in business. It doesn't give the business any market advantage because the competitors can get the same data. So there's no big advantage to the business in using secondary data. It does provide a framework. It does provide a setting for decision making and understanding where the business is and how well it's doing vis-a-vis the industry or vis-a-vis the national economy. But it doesn't really give any great advantage to the decision makers because it's not unique to the business. Primary data would be. That's data that's commissioned by the business. So the researchers go out and find primary data. That is the original source of the data. So market research, go out and talk to the customers. That's primary data. Find out what the customers' needs are, what the customers would like to see, what are the issues confronting the customers. And bringing back that sort of data and analyzing it is useful. That is what gives the business a uniqueness, perhaps a unique insight into that phenomenon, the phenomenon of the customer and the customer's needs. The final steps in the research, well, reporting the results. There's no point in conducting the research unless the results are reported. It's obvious that having conducted the research, having done the analysis, having gone through all of the stages and all of the issues, it's important to report. There should be an executive summary, some short way in which the managers and the readers can get to the essence of what was found and get to the essence of it very quickly by just reading perhaps a page or half a page, just summarizing, even in bullet points, what was found and what were the issues. So as well as the full report, there may be an executive summary. It should be an overview of the research. It should show what, how the research was conducted, what were the issues, how were the issues addressed. It should go into detail about the research and show honestly and openly the whole exercise. It should make recommendation strategies, recommendations for implementation. There's no point in doing the research unless it's going to be implemented. The business should work on the research. If the business had no intention of changing, but commissioned the research but no intention of changing, there was no point in commissioning it. The research took place because the business had a problem and it wanted the problem addressed. So the idea is to implement the recommendations. And there should be strategies developed that enable the business to do this. There should also be a technical appendix, depending on the nature of the research, but it should be a technical appendix if it's related to some technical issue in a business. Then clearly the terms, the language and the technicalities of the business should be presented for the reader to understand. But even if it's not related to a business in that technical sense, even if it's a market survey, then the statistical analysis that's conducted should be explained in a technical appendix. The equations that were used and the statistics, the way they were calculated, and the reliability of the statistics and the limitations of the whole exercise should be set out in the technical appendix. Now this has been a long discussion of various steps in the research process. It's one video amongst many on a similar set of topics, and all of these different videos link, so it's important to get a wide perspective by viewing several of them. I suggest you go back over the video, play it several times, use the stop button as often as you wish and make notes, and try and do some online research yourself to pad out some of the areas. Clearly research is important because it's where we get knowledge, and in business knowledge could be profits. That's all I'm going to say about this topic for the moment, so thank you for watching.